Hey, thanks all. We're going to get started now. So thank you for your patience and thank you so much for showing up. My name is Shyla Huck and I'm the Communications and Engagement Manager here at SkyTruth, and I am beyond excited to be speaking to the group that we've assembled today. First, I want to share a little bit of background information about what we're going to be discussing. So conversations at this year's UNGA and Climate Week have underscored the importance of increased cross-sector collaboration and action towards mitigating the impacts and causes of climate change. So put simply, it takes a village, right? But additionally, the outcomes of this year's Summit of the Future make it clear that science, technology, and data will continue to play a large role in addressing these issues worldwide. But how does one transform raw information into tangible material impact, whether it's through policy recommendations, frontline defense, or campaign advocacy? Organizations are stepping up to the plate and finding innovative ways to integrate open data into their work to transition us away from fossil fuels more broadly and offshore oil and gas in particular. Today's panel features a selection of expert data providers and campaigners, all of whom share a similar goal: use open data to unveil the impacts of offshore oil and gas that have historically been out of sight and out of mind, and place pressure on industries to prevent further expansion of the infrastructure. A few housekeeping items before we get into it. We are recording this webinar and we'll be sending it in a follow-up email early next week. Today's session will be in the format of a round robin of presentations from our panelists, followed by a Q&A moderated by yours truly. My colleague Eric will be moderating the chat where you can place any questions you might have for any of our panelists. If we don't get to your message live, we will email you after the fact. If you would like to, we'd love to hear who's here and where they're from, so please feel free to drop your name and location in the chat. Let's get started and meet today's panelists. So let's start off with John Amos, who is the CEO of SkyTruth. Welcome, John.
Well, thank you, Shyla, and welcome to all of you in the audience and my fellow panelists. I am a geologist by training. Spent the first 10 years of my professional career using satellite imagery as a tool to do oil and gas and mineral exploration around the world. This is back in the 1990s, and I became increasingly convinced that climate change was not a hoax. It was a real existential threat to people and the planet. And I decided I didn't want to spend my life's energy making that terrible problem worse. So I started SkyTruth in 2001 as a vehicle to use this same toolkit in space to promote conservation and shine a spotlight on environmental issues around the world.
Thanks so much, John. What a storied background. Lovely to have you. Next up, we're going to say hi to Anna Bevington, who is the Senior Spatial Analyst at Earth Insight. Welcome, Anna.
Hi, so I'm spatial analyst with Earth Insight, and I am actually here presenting on behalf of Bart Wickel, our research director. And I'm a geographer by training, and work predominantly in the Amazon, Congo, and Coral Basin regions. Thanks.
Fantastic. So happy to have you here. Next, we're going to say hello to Upasana Khatri, who is a senior attorney with the Center for International Environmental Law. Welcome, Upasana.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Shyla. I'm Upasana. I'm a senior attorney with the Climate and Energy Program at CIEL. I'm based in DC, and my work primarily focuses on protecting human rights in the context of the climate crisis by developing and supporting legal and advocacy strategies related to climate litigation and stopping the expansion of oil and gas. And my focus specifically is on offshore development, and I'm thrilled to be here with such an impressive group of panelists. So thank you.
Thanks so much. Next, we're going to say hi to David Cañas, who is here with AIDA, which is the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense. And welcome.
Thank you very much, Shaila. My name is David Cañas. I am a geographer. I've been working in AIDA 2 years now, and I am based in Ecuador, currently from Quito, Ecuador, the capital city. And I am very pleased to be here sharing this panel. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Great to have you. And finally, last but certainly not least, we have Andrew Hartzig, who is the Senior Director of the Arctic Program at the Ocean Conservancy. So welcome, Andrew.
Thank you, and big thanks to SkyTruth for organizing and hosting this whole panel. I'm Andrew Hartzig, Senior Director for Ocean Conservancy's Arctic Program. I am a lawyer by training, and I work on Arctic shipping issues and on offshore energy issues for Ocean Conservancy. Ocean Conservancy, for those who aren't familiar, is a nonprofit marine conservation organization. We're based in Washington, D.C., and Ocean Conservancy's vision is a healthier ocean protected by a more just world. And I am based in Anchorage, Alaska, and on Denino lands. Thanks.
Fantastic. Well, as you can see, we have quite the spread of intelligence and action. And let me just stop and let them tell you exactly what that means. So now we're going to be moving into the round robin of presentations. Each presentation will help us kind of build a little bit more background on how open data and direct action, as well as campaign advocacy policy recommendations come together. So first, we're going to have John Amos, who's going to be sharing how we leverage a tool called Cerulean to visualize the impacts of offshore oil and gas. So let's just make sure that this presentation is available. Fantastic. And then we can go to the next slide. And John, whenever you're ready, feel free to go ahead.
Thank you, Shyla, and thank you, Shannon, for wrangling the slides. Please move to the next slide. I'd like to tell you a little bit about SkyTruth. Again, I started the organization in 2001 with the intention of shining a spotlight publicly on some of the hidden impacts associated with fossil fuel exploration, development, and use. Over the years, we've expanded to cover a wide range of environmental issues. But at our heart, what really motivates us is to take advantage of this ever-expanding toolkit in space to build what we call conservation technology solutions to a variety of conservation issues and problems that we're confronting down here on the ground and in the ocean. And our toolkit is, we call it Earth observation data. Basically what that is images and other types of data collected by orbiting satellites. And this helps us see what's happening anywhere on the planet at any time, even if far out in the ocean. So we can cover issues like oil pollution out at sea that's previously been, as Shyla said, kind of out of sight and out of mind, and other issues like intensive overfishing in the ocean. And one project we built was called Global Fishing Watch to expose that problem. So next slide, please. But what I'm here to talk about today is a tool we've built called Cerulean. And that's a tool specifically designed to illuminate a particularly pervasive and annoying problem that has dogged me throughout my career working with satellite imagery. And that's the problem of chronic oil pollution out in the ocean. Not the big, massive accidental spills that generally attract a lot of media attention and a lot of public attention, but something else that we've become aware of over the years, which is the day-to-day smaller spills and incidents from commercial shipping out in the ocean and from offshore oil and gas platforms that are continually putting toxic oil and other substances into the water. And Cerulean is a tool that has automated the detection of these oil slicks at sea, taking advantage of a stream of free daily radar satellite imagery, courtesy of the European Space Agency, and taking advantage of Google's cloud computing platform and our skilled software engineers who have built a system that pulls in that radar imagery, automatically scans it, using models that have been produced by an artificial intelligence technique called machine learning to detect those oil slicks and put that on a publicly accessible map and in a publicly accessible database. And the real magic of this system is not only does it identify likely oil slicks in the ocean, in many cases it identifies the probable sources of that pollution, the vessels or oil platforms responsible for those detected slicks. Next slide, please. And because satellite imagery has been collected for years now, and this radar satellite imagery in particular has been collected since 2015, we can actually go back in time, analyze historical images with this tool, and build up a pollution track record for individual facilities. And this is an example of some work we did for Oceana and Uplift UK, looking at oil platforms in the UK waters of the North Sea. And shown in green are all of the oil slicks cerulean identified over a 2-year period. And in this example, circled in red at the center of each pinwheel is an oil and gas platform. So we can build up knowledge surrounding the chronic pollution load that these individual platforms are putting into the ocean. Next slide. And it's not just oil pollution that we're concerned with from offshore oil and gas facilities. It's the direct climate impact from activities like natural gas flaring, shown at the image at the bottom, and also direct venting, leaks, and emissions of unburned methane into the air, shown on the right. And we are eagerly awaiting data from the newly launched methane satellite that EDF has put into space, and the constellation of satellites that Carbon Mapper is launching that are going to give us the ability to pinpoint the facilities that are directly emitting methane and identify the operators who are responsible for that, which we think is a game changer in helping solve this problem. Next slide. And that's it. I encourage you to please reach out and contact me if you have any questions, reactions, suggestions. And with that, I'll turn it over to the next panelist.
Thanks so much, John. Yes, absolutely. Very excited about these new technologies and looking ahead, which is the perfect segue to Earth Insight, where Anna will be sharing the role of open data in accelerating the response to evolving offshore threats. So Anna?
Great. Well, hi, everyone. So I'll give a little bit of an intro into kind of the work that Earth Insight does. So Earth Insight is a research organization that was founded in 2022, and it maps extractive industry threats to people, nature, and climate. And it's really wonderful to be here today because this question about how open data can be used to address oil and gas threats is really at the core of the work that we do. Next slide. So we build transparency tools or Earth Insight builds transparency tools and momentum for restricting fossil fuels and other extractive industries threats to key ecosystems and indigenous and local communities. Our work really focuses on mapping and analyzing the threats of upstream and midstream activities. So we map concessions as well as fossil fuel infrastructure, such as pipelines and terminals, which allows us to identify new oil and gas development frontiers in the pantropics and beyond. And we do this in 3 main ways. So we collect the data, we're building and maintaining a comprehensive global oil and gas concession database. We map these threats, so we are identifying, like I said, the frontiers of oil and gas development, and then the ecosystems and communities that are most at risk. And then we provide civil society, governments, and industry, among other actors, with the tools to visualize, interpret, and communicate the threat of expanding fossil fuel development. Next slide. So the questions about accessibility of data are really at the core of our ability to map the threats posed by new oil and gas developments in offshore ecosystems. Spatial data, however, as many of you know, is too often inaccessible. And then even when this data is accessible, or even when it is available, this data can be viewable but not downloadable, like it is in a lot of the web maps that are available. It can be downloadable, but in complex formats, like in a list of coordinates or in unfamiliar file types. It can be visible in PDFs, but those are often hidden inside of industry reports, and again, not accessible. And then oftentimes this information is outdated in what we know is a very fast-moving industry. And these barriers mean that data aren't actually readily accessible to civil society and environmental researchers. And so an important part of our work at Earth Insight in collecting and managing an oil and gas database is bridging this gap between the data that's available and the data that our partners need and are able to use. Next slide. So the process of data collection and synthesis brings us to a product like this. This map illustrates the offshore oil and gas production and exploration blocks in the Coral Triangle from a report that we are currently preparing with SkyTruth. The Coral Triangle is the marine area around Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, and PNG, and the tropical waters support critically diverse ecosystems and local livelihoods. Having a standardized oil and gas data set for the region enables us to show that there are over 2 million square kilometers of oil and gas blocks in the Coral Triangle, and that offshore developments make up about 70% of all oil and gas development in the region. But only 16% of offshore oil and gas is currently in production. And this region seems to be experiencing a rapid expansion to meet the demand in Asia. So together, all of this gives us and other regional actors a fuller picture of how oil and gas is expanding in the Coral Triangle. Next slide. So regional scale maps are useful for identifying and communicating trends in the data and identifying hotspots of activity. But then when we zoom in, we're able to use this data to communicate more specifically about threats to marine ecosystems from offshore expansion. At a local scale, we're able to see the value of these data in the case of a rapidly expanding frontier, such as the proposed Rovuma LNG project in Mozambique. So by combining our data on upstream developments with other available oil and gas data from sources like the Global Energy Monitor and data provided by local partners on midstream developments, we can provide civil society organizations insights about the scale of a threat about the scale of the threat a proposed project like this poses to local ecosystems. And while many of these developments might never be realized, the fact that they are still in progress is a serious area of concern. And the further development of new oil and gas concessions is incompatible with climate goals, and the development in extremely ecologically and culturally rich areas like these should be ended altogether. Next slide. And so, yeah, that's where we are. We're continuously working to build open access data and visualization tools at the global and local scales. And I encourage you to reach out to either myself or our research director with any questions. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Anna. So interesting. Next up, we have Upasana, who's going to do a bit of a deep dive into oil and gas offshore infrastructure. So hand it off to you.
Thanks, Shyla. Again, hi, my name is Upasana. I'm an attorney with CIEL. Among other areas of our work, CIEL engages in research and the development of legal strategies, as well as campaign tools to support fights around the world against emerging offshore oil and gas expansion. However, for my presentation, I want to take a bit of a step back and situate the data tools developed by organizations like SkyTruth and Earth Insight within the broader context of offshore oil and gas activity. Next slide, please. So offshore oil and gas activity has been expanding steadily for some time, but recently there is a trend toward production in increasingly deep, even ultra deep waters. And one of the most significant growing threats to oceans is from the booming production and use of fossil gas, and especially LNG. While the gas that's liquefied from LNG might come from both onshore or offshore fields, The LNG industry uses the ocean essentially as a highway, and LNG infrastructure dots coastlines around the world. So it necessarily has major impacts on oceans. And as oil and gas activity moves further offshore and into tracts of oceans where the industry hasn't previously been, it poses a growing threat to marine conservation and biodiversity. This graph here shows how over the last century, the number of offshore operations has increased significantly. And as they move to deeper waters, they're impacting a growing number of species, as demonstrated in this graphic. Next slide, please. We're also seeing offshore build-out increasingly impacting fisherfolk communities. As seen in this map, the darkest blue areas, which indicate the highest concentrations of small-scale fisheries, are also places where there are some of the greatest number of offshore concessions. And there are many ways in which oil and gas activity can harm fisheries, such as by causing reduced or contaminated fish catch, and by displacing locals from traditional fishing grounds. So the perception that offshore projects are too far removed from human populations to harm health and human rights is completely false. Small-scale fisheries account for at least 40% of the world's total fish catch. And endangering them, offshore oil and gas activity can jeopardize the food security of entire regions and the livelihoods of roughly 500 million people. Also, the industry's move to deeper and more remote waters where ocean conditions are more volatile means that a lot of the new build-out is happening in regions that lack the infrastructure and resources to respond quickly in the event of disaster. That means everything is magnified. The possibility of well blowouts, like what we saw at Deepwater Horizon, the danger and difficulty of stopping a resulting spill, and the risks that the spill poses to surrounding life. In fact, research shows that for every 100 feet deeper a well is drilled, the likelihood of a spill increases by over 8%. Next slide, please. But it's not just the very real risk of blowouts and spills we need to worry about. As John mentioned during his presentation, offshore activity has adverse effects across all its phases, from seismic exploration and drilling in the seabed to coastal processing and overseas transport, and to the inevitable burning of the oil and gas produced. This diagram captures just a small fraction of these impacts. And as John said, it's important to emphasize that the operational and routine impacts are equally, if not more, concerning than accidental events. This includes the over 500 million tons of toxic wastewater that rigs dump into the ocean every year. It's also worth noting that even when offshore operations end, the legacy of harm doesn't. Due to high costs coupled with regulatory loopholes, as well as a general lack of oversight, many operators end up simply abandoning their rigs and wells without proper decommissioning and cleanup. This aging infrastructure can then continue to leak toxins and planet-warming gases like methane for decades. But because offshore oil and gas activities are out of sight, out of mind, especially when they're abandoned or left idle, they're inherently difficult to monitor and manage. This means that many adverse impacts go unnoticed and unmitigated. And again, I'm not just talking about the large oil spills, but also the smaller scale operational discharges, whether that's from the intentional release of bilge water from ships, methane leaks from infrastructure, gas flaring, or other everyday sources. The incremental effects of these emissions accumulate and are compounded by other stressors affecting our oceans, such as overfishing and climate change. So tools like SkyTruth Cerulean are really critical now more than ever to monitor and expose these impacts and risks, and really to guide our understanding of and response to current gaps in ocean governance. From a prevention standpoint, it's essential that coastal communities and other stakeholders have a better understanding of the full scope of marine ecological and human rights harms that these projects threaten, so that their participation in the decision-making processes are fully informed. Likewise, governments must be aware of and consider these impacts before approving or financing any such projects, and take measures to prevent, mitigate, and remedy harm when they occur. Finally, from an accountability standpoint, the public needs ready, up-to-date data on unfolding harms in order to expose culprits and ensure that polluters pay. That's it from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you for taking us to that bird's eye view of the issue. It's really helpful for me, for sure. And the perfect segue for David's presentation about how we're leveraging science to support environmental justice. So on to you, David.
Thank you very much, Shaila. Well, again, hello everyone. My name is David Cañas. I work as a scientist for AIDA, the Inter-American Association for Environmental Defense. AIDA is a regional organization that pursues environmental justice in Latin America and the Caribbean. In AIDA, we combine science and legal strategies to protect endangered ecosystems and communities from high-impact activities like oil exploration, production, and transportation. So given the importance of oceans in the climate regulation and its ecological services provided, we see it as a regional priority to protect our oceans, especially from oil pollution. Next, please. The Pacific, the Atlantic Ocean, as well as the Caribbean Sea, the Sea of Cortez, and the Gulf of Mexico are highly diverse areas, and people living nearby shores are highly dependent on the marine life and ocean's quality. But global climate change has impacted strongly the marine life. The map on the left shows the coral reefs and its level of risk of disappearing. Sadly, many of them are in red color, meaning high risk. At the same time, all extraction activities, especially offshore, have been incremented in the recent years, and the industry is planning to keep expanding. In addition, there is an undeniable history of orphan oil wells and infrastructure that is left behind when is no more profitable for the oil industry. The increment of oil extraction also means that more oil is transported inland and through our oceans. This increases the chances of oil reaching and polluting marine life. The image on the right shows a large number of tankers that navigate in our oceans constantly. Each red arrow represents the location of a tanker at the time that the image was taken. Next slide, please. Yeah, so how to tackle this problem? Well, in AIDA, we have a theory of change. The image shows a shorter version of it. We believe that environmental and human rights justice is achieved through processes that integrate science with legal frameworks. These processes should lead to effective decisions and to generate better capacities in Latin America and the Caribbean. Next, please. Here, I want to highlight the importance of data for the change we pursue. Data is the basis for our legal strategies, but this data needs to be trustable, accurate, and very important, accessible for everybody. It is also important to highlight that in AIDA, we do not produce data. This exceeds the scope of our organization. This is very important for us to establish alliances with scientific data providers like SkyTruth and others. But we actually do is we transform this data into information that can be used by our legal team. And also, we identify data and knowledge gaps in our region. Next, please. For instance, we have identified a lack of proper response in our region whenever an oil spill occurs. Part of this problem is because decision makers lack of enough information and resources. A proper response for an oil spill incident requires at least data about the origin of the spill, the area of impact, the nearby ecosystems, and the ocean currents. Luckily, SkyTruth and other open source data providers are filling these gaps with trustable information. Next, please. Yeah. This is an example of an oil spill incident report from SkyTruth occurred near Morrosquillo in Colombia. The image shows in orange the area covered by the oil slick, plus in red the direction of the potential source. This is a PDF and can easily be used by community members or decision makers. Next, please. Moreover, slick data can be downloaded for further analysis. The image shows, as an example, 2 slicks detected near the Gulf of Morrosquillo in the last 2 months. They are represented in color purple. In red, coral reefs are represented, and in blue, marine and coastal protected areas. These 2 oil spills incidents have the potential to negatively affect protected areas and biodiversity, and proper action may be required in order to safeguard them. Next, please. Finally, some conclusions. Urgent and stronger actions are required to protect our oceans, its biodiversity, and its services provided to all of us. These actions include attending to the huge and constant oil pollution that is affecting marine life. Legal strategies need to be constructed from strong data, information, and evidence. And finally, environmental data must be publicly available. It is our right to know what is happening to the environment that surrounds us. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. For sure, the line that sticks out to me is everyone does have a right to know what's happening around us. So next up, we're going to have Andrew speaking to policy recommendations around decommissioning. So, Andrew?
Thank you. Yeah, we can just skip ahead to the next slide. In the last few years, Ocean Conservancy has launched a clean ocean energy program. And our objective is responsible, rapid, and just transition to 100% clean ocean energy by 2050, which is admittedly a pretty audacious goal, but it's also a necessary one given the threat that's posed by the climate crisis. At the risk of oversimplifying, our clean ocean energy program seeks to support the responsible build out of offshore wind and possibly other marine renewable energy sources as they become viable. And then there's the other side of the coin. You can't have a clean ocean energy transition without getting rid of the dirty and dangerous fossil fuels. And for that reason, we're working to phase out offshore oil production in the US. The Gulf of Mexico generates about 97% of all of the oil and gas that's produced in US federal waters. So our advocacy is focused there on the Gulf of Mexico. You can go ahead and switch to the next slide. If we think of the climate crisis as a giant hole, our first step should be to stop digging. And with that in mind, Ocean Conservancy, like many other conservation organizations, opposes new offshore oil and gas leases and new offshore exploration and development. But in addition to that body of work, we're also working to hold offshore oil and gas operators accountable for the full and proper cleanup of their wells, their platforms, and their pipelines. And as other people have referenced, that cleanup process is called decommissioning, and it is part of the bargain that oil companies strike with the federal government. So from the moment an oil company buys an offshore lease, it is required to clean up any and all equipment and infrastructure that it builds on that lease. We can go to the next slide. So I don't know if this will come as a big surprise, but oil and gas industry has not done a great job meeting its cleanup obligations. Earlier this year, there was a report from the Government Accountability Office, the GAO. That's an independent, nonpartisan agency. And that report found that as of last June, more than 75% of the idle or end-of-life oil wells and platforms in the Gulf of Mexico were overdue for decommissioning. They had missed their decommissioning deadlines. And hundreds of those idle wells have not even been temporarily plugged. And then a different GAO report from 2021 found that oil and gas operators had left nearly 18,000 miles of disused pipeline just sitting on the bottom of the ocean at the Gulf of Mexico. And that number has likely only grown since then. This infrastructure backlog, the decommissioning backlog, is likely to grow as well because more and more of the shallow water leases in the Gulf of Mexico are reaching the end of their productive lives. And operators continue to defer cleanup operations and miss their decommissioning deadlines. So all this deteriorating and idle infrastructure poses safety threats to workers and government inspectors. It's all vulnerable to storm damage, which is something we're all thinking of now as there's a hurricane bearing down on Florida. As others have pointed out, it can be a source of oil or methane leaks. And it's just plain in the way. So imagine trying to route transmission lines for new offshore wind facilities if you have to navigate through a big spaghetti tangle of discarded oil pipeline. Next slide. In addition to the safety and environmental risks and user conflicts, decommissioning failures pose a huge financial risk. Cleaning up all of this infrastructure in the Gulf of Mexico is not going to be cheap. Estimates say that it will come with a total price tag of perhaps up to $70 billion, and it's entirely possible that that is an underestimate. To be clear, oil and gas companies are responsible to pay those decommissioning expenses, but the federal government only holds about $3.5 billion in decommissioning bonds, so way less than what it will take to actually clean up. So if oil and gas operators default on their cleanup obligations, there is a real risk that taxpayers could have to foot the bill for cleanup, which is just infuriating. And defaulting, by the way, is not just a theoretical concern. 37 offshore operators declared bankruptcy between 2009 and 2024, so it happens. Next slide. So ultimately, the irresponsible offshore oil and gas operators are the source of these decommissioning problems, but there are real weaknesses and gaps in federal oversight and enforcement. And those weaknesses and gaps have played a key role in aiding and abetting the oil and gas industry. I should say federal agencies have made modest forward progress in recent years, but there's a lot more that needs to be done to strengthen the regulations and policies and enforcement procedures that govern offshore oil and gas decommissioning. I won't read all the little bullets there, but I do want to highlight that last one about access to data and transparency. These offshore oil and gas wells and platforms are spread out all over the Gulf of Mexico. And as others have said, for the most part, they're kind of out of sight, out of mind. It's really difficult to track or monitor decommissioning activity or lack of activity. To their credit, federal agencies do provide some information through publicly accessible online databases, but those interfaces are usually not very user-friendly. The information provided can be incomplete and really inaccessible unless you're a superpower user who's really in the know. So the lack of accessible information makes it difficult for the public and for groups like Ocean Conservancy to monitor offshore oil and gas decommissioning and enforcement actions. So for groups like ours, it is hugely helpful and hugely important to be able to work with technical experts who can drill down into those agency databases and access useful information and data, and who can provide independent methods for monitoring and tracking those activities on the far-flung offshore platforms and wells. So I will leave it there and turn it back to you.
Really fantastic, but that's a bit of, I misspoke. Not quite fantastic. It's actually quite scary, but I appreciate all of your presentations. I think they really helped lay the foundation for a very lively discussion. So thank you all so much. As a quick note to folks in the chat, if you have any questions, please do drop them. We will be feeding them to our panelists. And if it's okay, before we get into the round robin, it seems like there might be a specific question for Anna that I'd like to just get out of the way. So Anna, do you have information on which data or platform you find particularly difficult to use?
Yeah, so I think when we're talking about data that's really difficult to use, we're not talking about kind of satellite imagery. We're really talking about kind of when it's kind of data coming from government ministries, and that's a best case scenario, or we're pulling data out of geoportals, we're pulling data out of PDFs, and that can come in a million different forms. And some, like Andrew just said, some of that's a lot more digestible, and some of it is really not very digestible for the average user, or even for us. So I hope that answers that question.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Feel free to drop in the chat if you have any follow-ups, Emma. But otherwise, I think we will move into the conversation, we'd like to keep it fairly open-ended. So rather than calling on each panelist to share their thoughts, I'll leave it open-ended, maybe prompt someone to begin. Our first question today is that it is one thing to have access to data, which I think we all know here is not a given, but how do you go from accessing open data sources to positive, meaningful change on the ground? And what are some of the challenges that you face while doing so? So I was really intrigued by your presentation, David, as I feel like it was a very specific example. So I'd love for you to maybe kick off this answer.
Sure. Yeah, and this is a very important question because at the end of the day, we all want to achieve this change, right? So data help us to understand the problem, and this is really, really important. But once the problem is understood, we need to move forward and set a strategy. In our case, sometimes we use litigation, sometimes advocacy, but the important thing is to always include communities and governments in these actions. Yeah, this absolutely comes with huge challenges because each stakeholder may have a different perception of the problem. But that is why setting a strong strategy capable of including diverse perspective is really important. Yeah, and so you might also want to work closely with different stakeholders, sometimes including everyone, sometimes separately, but trying to align all of our perspective, because at the end of the day, the benefit of cleaner ocean is to all of us.
I think that's great. And it totally speaks to the idea of collaboration being the solution. So thank you so much. Perhaps Upasana, I'd love to hear from you.
Sure. I definitely appreciate the question about challenges, and it's something that I know Andrew had also addressed in his presentation. So in terms of challenges, I want to hone in on CIEL's specific experience in the US. Here, as is the case globally, there isn't one definitive database on fossil fuel accidents. Information is spread across various agencies and databases, which makes getting the full picture of what's happening really difficult. FOIAs or public records requests on incidents often take an extremely long time to fill, making rapid response difficult. And requesting large batches of data from these channels are also unlikely to be successful, making it difficult to leverage open records laws to build large databases of spill incidents. That's why a lot of organizations are mostly dependent on media coverage of incidents, which really only capture a fraction of what's really going on. So this gap is what prompted CIEL, specifically our researchers, to focus on the data compiled by what's called the National Response Center, a call center run by the US Coast Guard and the EPA. Essentially, all chemical, fossil fuel, and train accidents are supposed to be reported in this call center. While it doesn't give a 100% full picture, because not everyone necessarily reports, it is the closest thing we have to a complete environmental accident database in the US. So CIEL is working to make this database more easily searchable and user-friendly, especially for parties interested in the risks of oil and gas. And we're doing this, for instance, by filtering out cases that are not related to industrial fossil fuel projects, filtering out duplicates, et cetera. We're also planning to combine this data with data from several state and national databases for a more complete and updated list. Ultimately, our goal is to create a much more easily searchable, comprehensive database on fossil fuel-related accidents that have occurred from the past decade. So stay tuned. We're excited to launch that research when it's ready.
Thank you so much. And then I'm just gonna, I know, Andrew, you just shared quite a bit about some of the issues, but do you have any other thoughts before I turn to our data providers?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just zooming out, if you're talking about translating data to action, I guess I kind of think in two channels. One is using the available data to inform communications and messaging and really develop messages and stories. And this comes from people who are, on the ground and have been affected directly. developing messages and stories that are meaningful and that are meaningful for different audiences, right? So you need to talk to technocrats who work at the federal agencies or legislators, and then you need to talk to everyday people who care about the ocean and the broader environment. So I think translating the data into messages is one critical component, and then maybe less sexy, but equally important is the work to translate the data into policy. So using those data to inform policy solutions, and then engaging in the political system, meeting with those with the folks from agencies who regulate, meeting with legislators who have the power to change the laws. And it's messy, and it often falls short of the ideal, but like that's what it takes to actually get the change on the ground. And it takes a long time, takes way longer than you want it to. But yeah, I think translating the data into useful and usable information for those audiences is really critical.
Thanks so much. I definitely appreciate the flag about time, because I think we are very much up against even the Climate Week theme is its time. So I appreciate grounding us in the fact that this is a long-term journey. So really quickly, I want to move over to our data providers, because I do also know from working with SkyTruth that there are some considerations on the data end. So maybe we can start with Anna and then end with John.
Yeah, so I would echo a lot of what Andrew just said. But as a data provider, a data communicator, we kind of have the power to tailor and make those decisions about what data are we showing depending on the audience. Because there is so much data. So there's crowdsourced data, there's big data, there's satellite imagery. And if we try and convey all of that, we run the risk of losing what the most important or impactful thread of the story is. And so identifying who your end user is, what information they need to be able to present, and ultimately creating a map or the insight that is most effective for them and the concerns that they have.
I think that makes a lot of sense and reflects what we've also experienced. John?
Yeah, that all of the things I've heard really resonate. Because at SkyTruth, we're generally a bunch of engineers and data geeks. Our expertise is, finding satellite imagery, pulling it out of the cloud, processing it so humans can look at it, and analyzing it and pulling inferences out of it that can be helpful for conservation action. What we're not good at is campaigning, swaying public opinion, understanding the right communications approaches to shape public opinion, and focus and target public pressure on governments and industry to clean up their act, to do a better job, to protect the public commons. And so that's why we're so thrilled to have partners like my co-panelists here that we can talk to understand what is it that we can produce with our technology tools that's going to be useful to the campaigners and legal support partners, so that they can actually make impact happen on the ground. So that's a really important part of the approach. The other thing I want to point out is people may have this impression that satellite imagery is just, we're awash in it. It's ubiquitously available anytime, anywhere. And actually, that's not the truth. For the satellite images that we're using to detect oil slicks in the ocean, we're only covering the offshore oil producing regions of the ocean on average once or twice a month, using the free public satellite imagery that we have access to. That's not very often. And that means what we're detecting and showing in terms of oil pollution is just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what's actually happening out in the ocean. That is alarming. There are commercial satellite systems that can help fill the gap, not only for pollution detection, but for detecting the presence of vessels like oil tankers carrying millions of gallons of crude oil that have turned off their public tracking beacons and are running dark out in the ocean, violating international maritime safety law and posing a huge risk of a major oil spill anywhere at any time, either because they're trying to evade crude oil trading sanctions, or they're involved in human trafficking or drug trafficking or some other activity. So we have a problem. We have a data gap problem that we need to address. And there are opportunities for philanthropy to help. One of our data platforms called SkyTruth Alerts takes advantage of a great gift that was provided to the world by the Norwegian government, where they bought all of the available high-resolution satellite imagery coming in daily, covering all of the rainforest areas in the world from a satellite company called Planet. That's available for free. We take full advantage of that and are working with partners on the ground who use that for rapid identification of incursions into indigenous protected areas like the Amaracari Reserve, shown behind me here in Peru, but also incipient activities of unauthorized logging, gold mining, and other extractive activities impacting protected areas and indigenous areas. So there are models for this, for how these gaps can be filled. And if anybody would like to hear more about that, please reach out. I'd love to have a discussion.
Really comprehensive overview, and appreciate everything that everyone has shared here. I think it is very clear that we have some significant challenges that we face, but clearly we have the folks in the room who know how to address it. So moving out of how to do it, I really want to hone in on why we're doing it and why it is so important to be addressing these issues right now. So what makes increased access to open data about offshore oil and gas activities at sea particularly relevant right now? And I'll leave it open to anyone.
I guess I can jump in and just say that, like, from my perspective, we are, I hope and I believe, living through a transition point where, we're at an inflection point, a time when we are shifting too slowly, but it's happening, shifting from fossil fuels to renewable development. And that's happening onshore, and slowly but surely it's happening offshore. And if we're going to manage that transition well, we need to have good data, and we need to be able to use those data to translate it into policy solutions and actions that will help accelerate and facilitate that transition. And if we don't do it now, like we talked about earlier, the clock is ticking on all of this. So I feel like this is a hugely important and hugely timely issue. So yeah, I mean, that's my quick and obvious answer.
Yeah, if I could kind of pivot from that, or kind of add on, I think as Andrew had mentioned, sort of the other pressure point is obviously climate change. Climate change is causing more frequent and more intense extreme weather events that can cause, damage to offshore and coastal infrastructure, leading to disastrous releases of hydrocarbons and chemicals into the ocean. And, while the sudden onset natural disasters might be more visible and newsworthy, slow onset impacts are also endangering offshore infrastructure and also heighten the likelihood of disasters at sea and on coastlines. For example, sea level rise can cause damage to platforms, refineries, and pipelines. And through coastal flooding and coastal erosion, drought can increase the likelihood of this flooding, and also heavy rainfall can increase the risk of mold growth, leading to further structural issues as well as electrical damage. In short, climate change means that more offshore disasters are in our future, which makes monitoring tools and open access data on spill incidents even more important. And it also raises the question as to why governments are increasingly, spending money on these projects when they're not sustainable financially, nor from a physical integrity point of view.
Yeah, I would like to echo Andrew's and Upasana's words, and also add, I will also add that the expansion of the oil uh, industry offshore is also very important. We are seeing how, for instance, Guyana, Brazil, Argentina, Ecuador, Colombia, and many other countries have plans to expand their oil extraction activities offshore. So this means more sources of uh, potential oil pollution. And again, in a context of climate change, with a warming atmosphere and a warming ocean, the probabilities of stronger tropical storms and hurricanes are very high. So yeah, this puts in great danger all this infrastructure. And also, as the climate action movement moves forward and the energy transition it's put in place, all the injustices and environmental crimes perpetrated by the oil industry can't just left behind. Just energy transition must include the ecological restoration of those ecosystems that are being polluted by the oil industry.
I'd love to jump in and show a few bonus slides that I brought, if that's possible. Shannon, can you bring up the slide 33 for us? Yeah, Andrew talked about this. David just mentioned this. We're continuing to build more and more hardware out in the ocean to produce oil and gas, and that stuff is exposed to weather, to salt water, to increasing vessel traffic and chance of collisions and other accidents, and of course, climate change. And right now in the Gulf of Mexico, we have yet another unprecedented hurricane bearing down on the Gulf Coast. It seems like each hurricane is an unprecedented hurricane now, with bigger storm waves, more ferocity, and more power to erode away the land on the shoreline that is the only protection for all these pipelines coming ashore, carrying the oil and gas to coastal storage facilities. So this graphic shows all the existing active platforms in the Gulf of Mexico. Next slide. That shows all the active pipelines on the seafloor, and you can see all the points where they come ashore. That's, nearly 20,000 miles of pipeline on the seafloor carrying mostly oil and some gas. All of that increasingly vulnerable to hurricane-driven storm waves and landslides that happen on the seafloor as a consequence of those stronger waves. And then in the next slide, we can see all of the abandoned segments of pipeline on the seafloor. Nearly 23,000 miles of pipeline on the seafloor, that spaghetti tangle that Andrew mentioned, that is just increasing the risk and hazard for all operations offshore. And I just wanted to note that operators, when they decommission these pipelines, are required to pump the residual crude oil out of those pipelines. I don't know who's checking. I don't know how anybody's assuring that that's happening. And in fact, just a few years ago, storm waves by a hurricane rocked one segment of pipeline on the seafloor off the coast of Louisiana, and it released more than 50,000 gallons of crude oil that had been sitting in that pipeline untouched, despite the fact that that pipeline had been officially abandoned and declared decommissioned years earlier. So I look at this map and I wonder, how many smoking guns are we looking at in terms of potential spill, risk, and threat to the coastal communities around the Gulf of Mexico? So that's all. Thank you, Shannon.
Thanks for sharing that visual. I think it really drives home the point of what everyone was saying. So I appreciate you taking that time. Okay. I am going to turn really quickly. I think, well, Anna, actually, I'm so sorry. Would you like to say anything?
No, you're totally good. I would just kind of echo what everyone else has said and say that what we're seeing in international bid rounds kind of across the pantropics is regardless of this known threat, countries or ministries across Africa, Latin America, Asia are focusing on building out offshore oil and gas blocks. So it's kind of full steam ahead.
Yeah, I think that's a trend we've been noticing as well. Um, we have a question that I think was initially for SkyTruth, but I think Earth Insight might also be able to answer. So Tomi, and I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly, said, thank you for this webinar. Thank you. I've been using SkyTruth Cerulean platform to monitor oil slicks from repeat offender supertankers. Recently, SkyTruth reposted one of my findings and confirmed the spill with their analysts, which was incredibly encouraging, and I'm so happy to hear that. Thank you for sharing it with us. I think I know which one it is. This experience highlights a question: how can Earth observation companies like SkyTruth and data communicators like Earth Insight further engage with non-experts and the general public to promote responsible use of their products and broader dissemination of insights? I believe this engagement is crucial for increasing public awareness and confidence in the technology's ability to understand and monitor the environmental impacts of offshore activities. Great question. Just to summarize, how do you have any thoughts about how to better engage the public within our tools and resources? So maybe Anna first and then John. Or I don't want to put you on the spot, either one of you that has thoughts.
I'm happy to go first. I think one of the, one of the things that's really fun and important about the kind of science communication is moving or making kind of maps and infographics less kind of science focused and bringing them into this kind of infographic accessible format that make them so that, oh, sorry, I lost the question actually, but that make it increasingly accessible to the public and that do make it more, that give people the confidence that they do know how the technology is working and what these threats are, and make all of that data much more kind of digestible. But yeah, I feel like the Earth Insight perspective. I'll pass it over to John.
Yeah, thanks, Anna. That's a great question, and I think I recall this specific use case also. And we're thrilled when we see people in the public using our tools, using them, appropriately, and publishing what they're finding. That's something I hoped from the very beginning when I started SkyTruth, that we could be a vehicle for introducing people to these technologies, making it as easy as possible for them to use it, and then giving them tools to really monitor and share what they're seeing happening in the areas that they care about, whether it's out in the ocean or in their backyard on land. And so we have a number of tools that do that. Cerulean is our oil pollution detection platform for the ocean. For years, we've run a platform called SkyTruth Alerts that publishes, again, in the US, those oil and hazmat spill reports from the government, but also a lot of other data sets as well. And we have thousands of users of that platform. And in the past, we've experimented with crowdsourcing the monitoring problem. We're a small nonprofit organization. We don't have enough staff and never will to have human eyes on every part of the globe where there are concerns. So we've been hoping that by setting an example for how we could do this, we could enlist the public in helping us be watchdogs for what's happening in the world. But there are challenges with that. Some of the imagery does require a little bit of expertise and knowledge to be able to appropriately understand and explain to others what you're seeing. That view from 250 miles up is a little bit different for most of us. It's not how we're accustomed to looking at the planet. And so I have seen some cases increasingly out on the web of what I call Earth observation malpractice. People who are convinced they're seeing a massive oil spill when they're looking at big patch of seaweed or a big area of rainfall or calm water in the ocean. So where I think I don't want to discourage people from producing those findings, but I think data providers like SkyTruth and others have an opportunity to engage in the public dialogue. When we see people publishing results and analysis or asking questions about what they're seeing in satellite imagery, can we weigh in with our experienced point of view on what they're finding? And I think that might be the most effective way that we can help the public, encourage the public to keep using these tools, but also ensure that the results are consistent with what we know about what we can and can't do with imagery and Earth observation tools.
Really fantastic insights, both. Thank you so much. And as always, if there's anything that the people who ask the questions want to have expanded upon, feel free to add in the comments. I wanted to move to a question that we received from Jordina. I'm not sure actually if it might have gotten deleted potentially. Jordina, if you're still online, can you just let me know if you no longer want that question answered? Okay, I'm happy to move on to another question that we received, which is given the increased use of Arctic routes. So, Andrew, I feel like this might be for you. Given the increased use of Arctic routes by Russian LNG and cargo ships to reach Asian ports, what unique challenges do Earth observation platforms face in monitoring environmental threats at high latitudes? I spoke too soon. It sounds like it's for everyone. Specifically, how do factors such as extended periods of darkness, sea ice coverage, and extreme weather conditions impact the effectiveness and reliability of satellite-based monitoring? What I might do is break this into two questions and ask our data folks about some of these limitations to data in the Arctic, and then translate it a bit and ask about how that poses a concern to those that are looking to use that data for policy recommendations. Does that sound okay to the panelists? And do either of our data folks have strong feelings about sharing?
Yeah, I do. You have hit a real weak spot for cerulean and oil pollution detection. For a couple of reasons. Again, we're right now reliant on a free public source of satellite imagery from the European Space Agency. And it's great for oil pollution detection. But they're operating that single satellite. Hopefully they'll launch a second one soon. They're operating that satellite with a whole bunch of priorities in mind: scientific research, monitoring activity in the waters of the European Union, and other juggling other priorities. And when that satellite approaches high latitude waters, Arctic and Antarctic waters, they switch it into a different mode of image data collection that is not as effective at detecting oil slicks. It's much more effective for mapping sea ice, which is a major concern for shipping in Arctic waters of Europe and other Arctic countries. And the other problem that we have is thin sea ice on a radar satellite image can look just like an oil slick. So it fools our model on a regular basis. And for that reason, at this time, we don't provide oil pollution results above a certain latitude because it would be too confusing for people. New radar imaging satellites are coming. Hopefully they succeed. That will have the ability for us to discriminate sea ice from oil, but we don't have it yet.
And I guess I can just jump in to confirm that's a really good question. And based here in Anchorage, we work with partners in the Bering Strait region who have expressed really deep concern about the level of vessel traffic that's moving through the Bering Strait. Anything that goes, on the northern sea route has to move through the Bering Strait to get there. And yeah, the transit of LNG and crude oil through that route is a really big concern. John, you mentioned earlier the idea of turning AIS off. There's also spoofing, transmitting a false location. There are terrestrial AIS stations that can track vessels, but if you've turned your AIS off or if you're broadcasting a false location, obviously those don't work. So yeah, that's a weak spot and a concern. And I'll just say an especially deep concern for the people who live in that region and who depend on the health of the ocean for their subsistence, for their food security.
Thank you both. Yeah, it's helpful to really see the full picture of some of the limitations we're working against. So we have about 15 minutes left. I have one more question that I'd really like for David and Upasana to answer, and then a closing question for all the panelists. And so the question I have for both of you is, as we've said, and I think we've used this term multiple times during this session, offshore can be very out of sight, out of mind. So many folks might not understand that there are very real, tangible impacts on coastal communities, their resilience, safety, and health, as well as the ecosystems and the animals that rely on them. So can you speak to this relationship and why it's so important that we're addressing offshore for onshore health?
Yeah, sure. I can start. Well, although roughly half of the world's population lives near shores, the impact of oil extraction offshore is still unknown to many people. That's really sad because from the exploration phase, the industry uses these seismic surveys, and this can have a huge impact on marine life. They can actually cause permanent hearing losses on some species. And also the drilling and all the pipelines that are put in place disrupt the marine life and the migratory pathways that uses some species. And this has an direct impact on fisheries, like Upasana mentioned in her presentation, and also in other activities like tourism that is beneficial for many people living in the coast. And these have an economical impact that goes direct to the communities living there.
Yeah, I want to echo everything David said. And, besides the impacts of the contamination, often the construction of offshore infrastructure is accompanied by fishing exclusion zones. So a lot of traditional communities are losing their access to these grounds that are essential not only for their food security, but for the food security of entire regions. Besides the seismic studies, as David said, impacting everything from microorganisms to whales, exploration activities like installing rigs and equipment, as well as drilling test wells, can introduce heavy metals and other toxins into the marine ecosystem. And there's really very little attention of these cumulative impacts. Usually when offshore oil and gas projects are being considered, kind of what is essential to the EIA processes and the approval processes are oil spill protocols, like how to manage oil spills. But there aren't really considering these operational everyday impacts that really can accumulate and have resounding effects on food webs, on coastal communities. And we also, like, we talk about the health impacts, but also oceans and coasts are so important to sort of the spiritual and physical integrity of so many indigenous local communities. And, to not address the impacts on their culture is really a violation of their rights to self-determination, to culture, to spiritual livelihood. And so overall, I think we do need more transparency and data on these everyday inevitable impacts of offshore oil and gas activity, because these are the ones that are being the most overlooked from a policy, legal, and regulatory standpoint.
Brilliant.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Sean.
I'd like to tag on to this because, one of the really overlooked issues related to offshore oil development is the intense coastal industrialization that has to happen to accommodate offshore development. That oil doesn't magically spring out of an offshore well and end up as gasoline in your gas tank. All of those pipelines are bringing that crude oil ashore. And what that means is giant storage tank farms, storage facilities have to get built right on the coast to receive that incoming crude oil from the ocean. Often refineries get built and positioned near those facilities because the proximity makes it a less expensive development prospect. And all of that is happening right down at sea level in the coastal zone, as we've heard, increasingly threatened by increasingly stronger storm waves, storm surge. They're predicting 20 feet from Hurricane Helene along the Florida coast today, and wind and wave action. And I'll just point out one case. One of the biggest individual oil spills that resulted from damage to offshore and coastal facilities by Hurricane Katrina in 2005 was a nearly 1 million gallon crude oil spill from a storage tank that got lifted up off its base by the storm surge. And then when the water receded, set back down, but not set down very gently. And that 1 million gallon spill of crude oil flooded people's homes in the coastal community of Chalmette, Louisiana. So as we build more and more of this in an era of increasing climate peril, we're really rolling the dice, not only with the marine environment and ocean health, but with the health of people living in coastal communities all around the world.
Really, truly impactful. That also, it looks like, Georgina, we received your follow-up of the question, and I see, if it's okay, and I think Eric will also share this, we might answer that in full in email just so we can make sure we give you a comprehensive answer and don't try and rush it in these last 10, and also give everyone a nice wrap up to this and a start to the rest of their day. So I wanted to end this with a little bit of eco-optimism because I don't know about anyone else. I'm kind of feeling bummed just a little bit. But here at SkyTruth, and I know our co-panelists feel the same way, eco-optimism is not just a catchphrase or a nice to have. It is necessary for us to continue the work that we're doing. So for the folks here who are doing the work, keeping me optimistic, what is something you're excited about for the future? I'm keeping it broad. Feel free to answer. And let me make it easier. I'll call on you and you can answer. On my screen, I've got Upasana first.
Sure. Great question. So I'm really excited, and I think this panel kind of exemplifies it by just the diversity and volume of monitoring and data tools that are starting to emerge. And I'm really excited to see that communities are starting to get their hands on these tools and incorporate them into their advocacy. David talked about that in the context of Colombia. And it's important to note that while these tools shouldn't displace the local testimony and Indigenous knowledge that these communities have relied on for generations to observe and document environmental changes, they will hopefully serve as an important complement in their efforts to protect rights and hold polluters accountable.
Great answer. Next up, I've got Anna.
Yeah, it definitely feels like a bit of a cop-out answer, but being a part of a panel like this really, to me, exemplifies the way that data transparency and communication can and is creating change. And it gives me a lot of hope to see how this small corner, or my small corner of the environmental movement, is being taken forward by others and is being used to affect real change at a community scale and at a much larger scale. So that gives me hope for today.
Definitely did not plant that answer, but I loved it. Thank you. Next up, I've got David.
Yeah, thanks, Shaila. Yeah, great questions to finish this panel. I think that now and in the future, spaces and events like this one will become more relevant. And decision makers eventually will have the chance to take decisions, more or very well informed decisions with data that can be used to put us in the correct path to tackle both climate change and pollution.
Really excellent. Thank you. Okay, Andrew.
I have two. They're a little bit untethered from the data angle, but they do give me optimism. One, when I started doing this work in Alaska in 2008, there was a big push to develop the Arctic Ocean. Shell Oil Company was making a big push to drill in the Chukchi and Beaufort Seas. There were well over 700 offshore leases at that time. And then over the course of the next few years, there was a huge campaign, really concerted effort among a rainbow of different conservation groups, indigenous groups, everybody, to push back against that development. And today, as we sit here now, I think maybe one or two of those leases are still in existence. Nothing is happening. There's very little interest in drilling in the Arctic. I'm knocking on wood as I say that, but that was a big success, and it gives me hope. You know, we talked about the idea that there's interest in further development offshore. It gives me hope that we can stop that development. And then the second thing, just super quickly, relating to decommissioning, one of the exciting things about that, I've talked about it as a big problem. It's also a big opportunity. A lot of those oil and gas jobs can be, you know, we can kind of jujitsu and have decommissioning jobs and turn people who would have been oil and gas exploration workers and development and production workers into people who are actively taking that infrastructure out of the ocean and still getting paid good wages, and, you know, feeding that into a just transition. So those are my two.
I love the pragmatic, actionable suggestions. Thank you. And to quote myself again, last but not least, John, what's something that's keeping you optimistic?
This is a great question, and lots of things are, but I'll kind of home in. One is just the explosion in technology that's available to us. That makes me really excited, because we're able to do stuff now that I couldn't dream of being able to do just a few years ago. One thing is detecting all this oil pollution happening way over the horizon offshore in the middle of the ocean. Another thing is methane. Methane is just hugely consequential for climate. And we know the oil and gas industry is a huge emitter, often intentional emitter, of this critical greenhouse gas. And as Fred Krupp at EDF said, you know, methane is short-lived, but packs a really powerful punch. And also the vast majority of what's being put in the atmosphere is happening from a very small number of operations. if we can detect those and home in on those, we can buy ourselves time to do the really hard thing, which is shifting global society's approach toward consumption. So the satellite fleet is coming to enable us to do that. I'm very excited about being able to bring methane detection technology out into the public realm where everybody can see it and work with it. And the other thing I'll say is about that is knowledge is power, and data produces knowledge. If you get the right data, do the right analysis with it, and put it in the right hands. And when I started SkyTruth, all of that knowledge and power was concentrated in the hands of industry and in the hands of government officials who were all too readily convinced to look away and not pay attention to the problems. Open data, and again, this growing technology toolkit is flipping that equation on its head. And through partners like my friends on this panel, we're seeing how civil society can take that data and that knowledge and have a seat at the table on the decision-making processes and the policy-making processes that are going to so critically shape our future and the future for generations to come. So I'm really excited to have a role in helping civil society wield that power to create a better future.
I'm glad I ended on that question. Definitely in a better place. So, thank you all so much to our panelists, first off, for your time, for your expertise, and for your generosity with the knowledge. I think that's a key theme I've had as I've spoken with you all and learned a bit more about your work. For folks that are still in attendance, as a reminder, we are recording this webinar and we'll be sending it along with the slide deck and contact information for our panelists early next week. We have a few minutes, and so maybe the best gift I can do is give you back a couple of extra minutes, unless anyone on the panel has anything else to say.
Just a big thank you for organizing this. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Yeah, this was truly lovely, and the questions from the audience were really provocative. I shouldn't maybe say this out loud, but we're definitely having side chats like, what fascinating questions. We definitely have things to think about. So thank you all so much. I hope you have a fantastic rest of your day, rest of Climate Week if you're there. And yeah, have a wonderful one. Bye all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thanks.